It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages.
At 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
Earlier today, I ordered American forces to strike Iraq. Our missiles sent the following message to Saddam Hussein: when you abuse your own people or threaten your neighbors, you must pay a price.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
Those are some of the consequential actions ordered by American presidents over the last 62 years. And behind each of those moments were dramatic scenes away from the press and the cameras in the White House Situation Room. That's the topic of the new book titled The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis, which also gives an inside account of the Situation Room on January 6th, 2021. With us now, the book's author, George Stephanopoulos. He is, of course, the co-anchor of Good Morning America and the host of ABC's This Week. He also served as a senior advisor, of course, in the Clinton White House. And George, man, this is such a thrill to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
It was also thrilled to hear you and Willie talk during the break about 8 o'clock bedtimes. It's something we all share. You're really nice. Yeah,
well, exactly. I mean, for you, it may be 8 o'clock. You may be healthier than us. For us, it's 6 o'clock. It's Wheel of Fortune, and then boom, we're in bed. But George, what excites me so much about this book is that you didn't have a front row seat to history. You were a part of history. You were there inside the Clinton White House. You saw this happen. You also take readers in a place where we've never been before, and that's inside the Situation Room on January the 6th. Tell us about that and what else we're going to read in this book.
Most harrowing story in the book, Joe. I tracked down a duty officer, a White House Situation Room duty officer named Mike Stiegler, who's actually inside the Situation Room on January 6th. And he talks about going in for his 12-hour shift, driving in around 4 a.m. and knowing as he was driving in to the White House that day, quite early in the morning, that something was off in the city. And he was on duty, on watch, when the Capitol was breached, when the riot broke through the security line at the Capitol. And what he describes happened next is just unbelievable and stunning. He was in direct contact with the Secret Service, hearing how much danger Vice President Mike Pence was in, even though, you have some politicians like Senator J.D. Vance, who I know you were just talking to about a few minutes ago, who now question whether the vice president was really in danger that day. Mike Stiegler says there was no question that the vice president was in danger that day. And the situation became so harrowing on Capitol Hill that the White House Situation Room had to do something that had only been done once before in the history of the United States, and that was implement what is called these continuity of government operations. That's the whole set of procedures that sets up the line of succession that was designed originally by Dwight Eisenhower to make sure the government survived a nuclear attack. They had to start to implement these procedures on January 6th, setting up different situation rooms, being ready to move people in the government to safe locations. And it had only been done once before on 9/11. They started to implement these procedures on January 6th because of what was going on in the Capitol, inspired by the President of the United States. Just imagine that. Joe, the White House Situation Room over the course of the 60 years since John F. Kennedy created has dealt with assassinations of presidents, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, attempted assassinations on Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. They've dealt with terror attacks on 9/11. They've dealt with wars. They've dealt with natural disasters. But here on this day, they were dealing with an insurrection against the United States government inspired by the President of the United States. And I asked Mike Stiegler when I spoke with him, did the President ever call down to the Situation Room that day? Not once.
Wow. Wow. I guess not surprising, but still shocking, George. Good morning. Congratulations on the book.
Well,
boy, this is just full of extraordinary new reporting. And as Joe said, lets us inside a room that most Americans never will see. You talked before January 6th about the way Donald Trump, then President Trump, was viewed. His Homeland Security advisor, Tom Bossert, said this: he was the least disciplined, least organized human I've ever met in my life. None of his staffers could stop him from constantly undermining us and making decisions outside the process. So what did Tom Bossert and others see inside that room that alarmed them, George?
I think Tom Bossert, who had served in other administrations, who had served in George W. Bush's administration. You did have several veterans of other administrations like John Bolton, who also served in the Trump White House. And what they say to a person is that there was nothing normal about the Trump White House and the way the Situation Room was used. It was used to fire Omarosa. That had never happened before. Donald Trump himself didn't use it all that much. And, you know, what had been built up in those 60 years was a process that was continued across administrations, Republican and Democrat. Probably the person who ran it best and was Brent Scowcroft, who did it for George H.W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush. But everything broke down in the Trump administration. And in many ways, you find times, and I spoke with many Situation Room duty officers and others who were working at the time, who described almost like they were trying to run the government almost at times in a way that would keep the policies of the Trump administration going, despite what the president himself was doing. And, you know, most notably on the issue of Ukraine, where they were trying to send aid and assistance to the new government, and the president was holding it up because he wanted to, you know, have Zelensky investigate the Bidens.
So, George, congrats on the book. Talk to us about the Situation Room the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. The president of the United States, of course, was not there. He was in Florida at an education event when the planes hit the World Trade Center and more. But take us inside the room. What happened there, and what was the expectation as to what was going to occur there?
Well, it's an incredible story. First of all, the Situation Room, you know, they clocked when the first plane went into the World Trade Center, but immediately when that second plane went in, a duty officer named Rob Hargis said immediately, "America is under attack." He called those words into the sit room director, Deb Lower, who was actually traveling with President Bush that day, who told them to Andy Card, who said them to the president. And those became, you know, the most famous words from that day: "America is under attack." But what's most incredible about that day and the valor and the patriotism we saw exhibited that day is the way the Situation Room duty officers reacted. Number one, even if they were off duty that day, they raced in to the Situation Room to be there. Number two, you'll remember that after the second plane hit the World Trade Center, there were many more planes in the air, and everyone believed that the White House was a target. And in fact, the White House was ordered to evacuate. And the sit room duty officers were ordered to evacuate, not once, not twice, but 3 different times they were ordered to evacuate. And every single time, they just looked up and kept on doing their job. I spoke with one duty officer named Ed Padinsky, who was a naval officer, who said, you know, this is where we fight from. They were determined to do their duty that day. It finally, because it became clear they were not going to leave, they finally passed around little 3x5 cards and asked each person who was there to write down their name and social security number so they could put that in a safe space. It was called the kill list, so they would know who might have died in the Situation Room on that day.
George, having done all this reporting on what the Situation Room was like under Donald Trump in his first administration, I don't know the degree to which history can give us some sense of what might happen next, but if Donald Trump gets elected in November, what kinds of things and what kind of usage of the Situation Room are you imagining in the second administration?
It's going to be uncontrolled. You know, one of the things that I point out, and others have pointed out as well, but I pointed out in my chapter on President Trump, is the most damning testimony of his competence and character comes from those who had the most senior level positions in the White House Situation Room who served under them. from James Mattis, the defense secretary, from John Bolton, his national security advisor, from John Kelly, his White House chief of staff, who all talk about how frightened they are by the prospect that he would become president again, apparently with no guardrails, without the kind of people who were serving him in the first term. Instead of having guardrails, it appears that he's going to have a bunch of enablers like those you see, sitting with him in the courtroom over the last several days. And it's something that is chilling to many of those who served in the Situation Room and during the first administration, but are no longer supporting President Trump.
George, I have to ask on behalf of Mika, who is not here today, about the Grill Flame program involving her father, the great Zbig Brzezinski, and a briefing he gave to President and First Lady Carter. Tell us about it.
Just incredible. I came across, as I was working on the book early on, a one-line diary entry in Jimmy Carter's diary. It was from May 8th, 1980, and it said, had a briefing in the Situation Room on parapsychology, using remote viewers to find longitude, latitude, etc. That was the most intriguing line I saw in Jimmy Carter's diary. It had parapsychology and the Situation Room. And I finally was able to come across the naval officer who was there that day, who gave him the briefing. And what happened was, it was Jimmy Carter, Zbig Brzezinski, you see Zbig right there, and Rosalind Carter, which was the other reason this was kind of an unusual meeting in the Situation Room. It was the only one I could find where a First Lady was actually in an official briefing in the Situation Room. And they had this naval officer who had become an expert in what was called Operation Grill Flame. You just mentioned it was an actual program in the United States government in the 1970s and the 1980s where they used psychics to do what they called remote viewing, to sit in dark rooms and kind of imagine situations happening around the world. Now, why is that date important? May 8, 1980. That was 2 weeks after the failed rescue mission for the Iran hostages. Jimmy, crippled the Carter presidency. He was locked in a re-election race with Ronald Reagan. He was losing. He was about to lose. The economy was flatlining. So he was just looking for any information he could possibly get. So he gets this briefing on the parapsychology program, doesn't say a word. At the end of it, takes out his notepad, just writes one word on it and slides it across the table to Jake Stewart. The word was hostages. Can you do anything?
Wow.